My boss made me train my replacement. She was sleeping with my husband. My stepmom sold my dead mom's jewelry. I had her arrested for grand theft. You don't need it anyway. It's just sitting there collecting dust, Linda said, standing in my kitchen at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, casually mentioning she'd sold my deceased mother's entire jewelry collection for $100,000. My name is Amber Nelson, I'm 28 years old, and I work as a forensic accountant for Morrison & Associates in Seattle. In that moment, watching my stepmother sip coffee from my mother's favorite mug, I realized I was about to document the most important case of my career. My father, Michael, was lying in a hospital bed at Seattle General, recovering from a massive stroke that had left him temporarily unable to speak or make decisions. Linda had been his wife for only 3 years, but she spoke with the authority of someone who believed she owned everything in his house, including the jewelry collection that had been explicitly willed to me in my mother's testament 7 years ago. I've already deposited the money into our joint account, she continued, scrolling through her phone. The antique dealer said some of those pieces were really valuable. Who knew your mother had such expensive taste? I didn't react. I simply nodded, thanked her for telling me, and asked if she wanted more coffee. Linda looked surprised by my calm response. She'd clearly expected tears or accusations. Instead, I was already mentally cataloging every detail, every admission, every piece of evidence she was unknowingly providing. What Linda didn't know was that I'd spent the last 5 years investigating financial crimes for a living. I specialized in asset recovery and fraud cases, particularly involving inheritance disputes and elder abuse. She'd just confessed to grand theft to someone who documented financial crimes for a living. My mother, Sarah, had died when I was 21, leaving me her entire jewelry collection in a will that had been properly probated and filed with King County. The collection included her grandmother's Victorian diamond set, her wedding ring from my biological father, who'd died when I was 10, and several pieces she'd inherited from her own mother. The total appraised value, according to insurance documents from 2019, was $127,000. Linda had entered our lives when I was 25. My father had been lonely for years, and she seemed kind enough. She was 42, claimed to be a retired nurse, and had moved to Seattle from Portland after her difficult divorce. She was attentive to my father, cooked his favorite meals, and seemed genuinely interested in his work as a civil engineer. The first red flag I should have noticed was how quickly she moved into his house. Our family home, where my mother's belongings were still carefully preserved in a cedar chest in the master bedroom. Linda had asked about clearing out some of the old things within 2 months of dating my father. Dad had firmly told her that everything of my mother's was mine, according to her will. Of course, honey, Linda had said sweetly. I just want Michael to be able to move forward. The second red flag was how she'd started asking detailed questions about my father's financial situation. As a forensic accountant, I recognized the signs. Casual inquiries about his retirement accounts, life, insurance policies, and the value of the house. When I'd mentioned this to my father, he'd laughed it off. She's just trying to understand our family situation, he'd said. After her divorce, she's worried about financial security. It's natural. The third red flag was the prenup. Linda had insisted they didn't need one because we're too in love to ever divorce. My father, romantic and trusting at 58, had agreed. I'd tried to convince him to protect his assets, but he'd accused me of not wanting him to be happy. They'd married in a small ceremony in 2021. I'd attended, smiled in photos, and hoped for the best. Linda had seemed genuinely happy, and my father was more energetic than he'd been in years. But over the past year, I'd noticed changes. My father seemed more tired, more confused about his finances. Linda had convinced him to add her name to his checking account to help with bills. She'd also suggested he update his will to reflect their new family situation. When my father had his stroke 6 weeks ago, I'd rushed to the hospital to find Linda already there, holding a folder of documents. She'd been prepared, too prepared. She had medical power of attorney, financial power of attorney, and copies of all his insurance policies. I'm so glad Michael set all this up, she'd told the doctors. He wanted to make sure I could take care of everything if something happened. My father had signed those documents 3 months earlier, according to the dates. Around the same time, he'd started seeming more confused and forgetful. Now, sitting in my kitchen, Linda was telling me about selling my mother's jewelry with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. She clearly believed that with my father incapacitated, she had free reign over everything in his house. The antique dealer was so nice, she continued. His name is Robert Chen. He has a shop called Heritage Antiques on Pine Street. He said the Victorian set alone was worth $40,000. I had no idea old jewelry could be so valuable. I made mental notes. Robert Chen, Heritage Antiques, Pine Street, Victorian set, $40,000. Linda was building my case for me, one detail at a time. I hope you don't mind, she said, though her tone suggested she didn't particularly care if I minded. Michael needs money for his care, and that jewelry was just sitting in a box. At least now it can help him. I understand, I said quietly. When did you sell it? Yesterday morning. Mr. Chen paid in cash. Well, a cashier's check. Very professional. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo she'd taken of the check before depositing it. See? $100,000 exactly. Michael will be so relieved when he wakes up to know we have this extra money. I memorized the check number, the bank name, and the exact amount. Linda had just provided me with photographic evidence of receiving proceeds from stolen property. Did you happen to keep any receipts or paperwork? I asked. Oh yes, Mr. Chen gave me a detailed receipt. It's in Michael's desk at home. Linda seemed pleased that I was being so reasonable about the situation. You know, Amber, I was worried you might be upset, but you're handling this so maturely. Your mother would be proud. Something cold settled in my chest at those words, but I kept my expression neutral. I'm just glad Dad will have the money for his care. After Linda left, I sat in my kitchen for exactly 10 minutes, processing what had just happened. Then I went to my home office and opened a new case file on my computer. I labeled it Estate Theft Investigation, Sarah Nelson Jewelry. Collection. First, I retrieved my mother's will from my safe. The language was explicit. I leave my entire jewelry collection, including but not limited to all rings, necklaces, bracelets, earrings, and watches, to my daughter Amber Ellen Nelson. The will had been probated in 2017. The jewelry legally belonged to me regardless of where it was stored. Second, I pulled the insurance appraisal from 2019. Every piece was photographed and described in detail. The Victorian diamond parure, necklace, earrings, and bracelet. $47,300. My mother's 2-carat engagement ring from my father, $18,500. My great-grandmother's Art Deco emerald ring, $20,100. The list went on for 3 pages. Third, I called my father's lawyer, David Hoffman, who had drafted both my parents' wills. Amber, I'm so sorry about your father's condition, David said. How can I help? David, I need to confirm something about my mother's will. Her jewelry collection was left to me, correct? Absolutely. That's been legally established since 2017. The jewelry belongs to you regardless of its physical location. Why do you ask? I explained the situation. David was quiet for a long moment. Amber, that's theft. Clear and simple. The fact that Linda had access to your father's house doesn't give her ownership of your property. You need to file a police report immediately. I will, but I want to build an airtight case first. Given your profession, I'd say you're certainly qualified to do that. But don't wait too long. You want to recover the jewelry before it disappears. Completely. After talking to David, I drove to Heritage Antiques on Pine Street. Robert Chen was exactly as Linda had described. Professional, knowledgeable, and fortunately, very concerned about legal compliance. I run a legitimate business, he explained after I showed him my identification and explained the situation. I always ask for proof of ownership on high-value items. Mrs. Nelson showed me what appeared to be a valid power of attorney for her husband. Did she claim the jewelry belonged to her husband? She said it was part of his estate and that she had the authority to sell it for his medical expenses. She seemed very knowledgeable about the pieces. She knew their history and origins. Of course she did. Linda had probably been studying my mother's jewelry for months, planning this theft. Mr. Chen, I have documentation proving this jewelry legally belongs to me. My stepmother had no authority to sell it. I showed him copies of the will, the probate documents, and the insurance appraisal. Robert's expression grew troubled. This is clearly a legal matter that's beyond my expertise. I've already resold several pieces to collectors, but I can provide you with all my documentation and contact information for the buyers. I had no idea this was stolen property. I understand. You acted in good faith based on the documents she provided, but I will need that information to recover my mother's jewelry. Robert cooperated fully, providing detailed records of every piece Linda had sold and where each item had gone. 3 pieces had been sold to collectors in California. The Victorian set had been purchased by a dealer in Vancouver. My mother's engagement ring, the piece that hurt most to lose, had been sold to a young couple who'd seen it in the shop window the day after Linda sold it. That evening, I called my father's hospital room. Linda answered his phone. "Hi, honey," she said cheerfully. "Your dad is doing much better today. He even said a few words." "That's wonderful news." "Linda, I was wondering if I could come by the house tomorrow to pick up a few things." "Of course, you know you're always welcome. What do you need?" "Just some old photo albums. I want to bring them to show Dad." "That's so thoughtful. I'll be here all morning." What I actually needed was to document the crime scene and locate any additional evidence Linda might have left behind. The next morning, I went to my father's house with a small digital camera and evidence bags. Linda was in the kitchen, organizing what appeared to be financial documents. "The photo albums are in the living room closet," she said without looking up. "Top shelf." Instead, I went directly to my mother's cedar chest in the master bedroom. It was empty except for a few scarves Linda had apparently deemed worthless. My mother's jewelry box was gone entirely. In my father's desk, I found Linda's receipt from Heritage Antiques, exactly where she'd said it would be. She'd been telling the truth about that detail, which made her confidence even more chilling. The receipt listed every piece individually with detailed descriptions and prices. I also found something Linda probably didn't know existed: my father's insurance file for my mother's jewelry. He'd continued paying premiums on a separate policy that covered the collection specifically as my inheritance. The policy was still active, with me listed as the sole beneficiary. Linda had stolen insured property. The insurance company would want to prosecute to the fullest extent of the law. In the kitchen trash, I found the original packaging from my mother's jewelry box. Linda had thrown it away, apparently confident no one would ever question her actions. "Find what you were looking for?" Linda asked, returning to the kitchen as I was photographing the receipt. "Yes, thank you." I held up a random photo album I'd grabbed from the closet. "Dad will love seeing these old pictures. He's lucky to have such a caring daughter," Linda said. Then she paused, studying my face. "You know, Amber, I hope you understand why I had to sell your mother's jewelry. Michael's medical bills are going to be enormous. I'm just trying to take care of him." "I understand you're concerned about his care," I said carefully. "Good. I was worried you might be upset about it. Some people get strange about jewelry and sentimental objects, but you're practical, like your mother was." Linda had never met my mother. Sarah had died 4 years before Linda came into our lives. She was building a fictional relationship with a woman she'd never known, using stolen jewelry as props in her performance of grief and care. That afternoon, I filed a police report with the Seattle Police Department. Detective Maria Santos was assigned to the case. "This is pretty straightforward theft," Detective Santos said after reviewing my documentation. "Your stepmother sold property that legally belonged to you. The fact that she had access to the house is irrelevant. Access doesn't equal ownership." "What's the timeline for arrest?" "Given the value involved, over $100,000, this is grand theft in the first degree. We'll need to coordinate with the prosecutor's office, but I'd expect an arrest warrant within 48 hours. "Detective, there's something else you should know. I suspect my stepmother may have been drugging my father or otherwise manipulating him before his stroke. His behavior changed significantly in the months before his medical emergency." "That's a serious allegation. Do you have any evidence?" "Not yet. But I'd like to request a toxicology screen and a review of his medical records from the past 6 months. If Linda was systematically drugging him to gain control of his assets, the jewelry theft might be just one part of a larger fraud scheme." "Detective." Santos made notes. "We'll look into that. Elder abuse cases often involve multiple types of exploitation." While waiting for the legal process to unfold, I focused on recovering the jewelry. I contacted each buyer Robert Chen had identified, explaining the situation and providing documentation of ownership. The collectors in California were cooperative. They returned the pieces in exchange for refunds and agreed to testify if needed. The dealer in Vancouver was more difficult, initially claiming he'd purchased the items in good faith and shouldn't bear the loss. After I explained that stolen property remains stolen regardless of good faith purchases and that he could pursue damages against Heritage Antiques if he chose, he agreed to return the Victorian set. The young couple who'd bought my mother's engagement ring were heartbroken. They'd purchased it as their wedding ring, drawn to its vintage style and romantic history. "We understand it needs to be returned," the bride-to-be said tearfully. "We just loved that it represented a lifetime of love." I felt terrible for them. They were innocent victims of Linda's theft. After recovering the ring, I sent them information about estate jewelry dealers who specialized in similar vintage pieces. It wasn't enough to undo their disappointment, but it was what I could do. On Thursday morning, Detective Santos called me. "We have the warrant. Mrs. Nelson will be arrested today. Can you meet me at the hospital? We expect she'll be there with Bai Xiao, your father." I arrived at Seattle General at 11:30 a.m. Linda was indeed in my father's room, feeding him lunch and chatting cheerfully about discharge planning. "The physical therapist says you're making excellent progress, honey," she was saying. "We'll have you home in no time." My father looked up when I entered. His speech was still limited, but his eyes were alert. "Amber," he said slowly. "Good. To see you." "Hi, Dad. How are you feeling?" "Better." "Linda." "Taking good care." Linda beamed at this praise. She clearly believed she'd successfully manipulated the situation and that my father's gratitude proved her innocence. At 11:47 a.m., Detective Santos entered the room with two uniformed officers. "Linda Nelson?" Detective Santos showed her badge. "You're under arrest for grand theft in the first degree." The change in Linda's expression was instant and dramatic. The sweet, caring wife persona disappeared, replaced by panic and calculation. "There must be some mistake," she said, backing toward the window. "I haven't stolen anything. Michael, tell them." My father looked confused and alarmed. His limited speech made it impossible for him to understand or respond to the situation quickly. "Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent," Detective Santos continued, signaling the officers to approach Linda. "This is about the jewelry, isn't it?" Linda's voice became shrill. "Amber, how could you do this to your father? He needs that money for his medical care." "The jewelry legally belonged to me," I said quietly. "You sold stolen property." Linda's eyes darted between me, the police officers, and my confused father. "Michael, tell them I had permission. Tell them you said I could handle your affairs." My father was struggling to speak, clearly distressed by Linda's panic and the presence of police in his room. "The power of attorney for your husband's assets doesn't extend to property that belongs to his daughter," Detective Santos explained as the officers handcuffed Linda. "You've been charged with theft of property valued at over $100,000. As they led Linda away, she made one final, desperate appeal to my father. "Michael, I love you. I was just trying to help. Don't let them do this to me." My father watched her go, then turned to me with questioning eyes. "Dad?" "Linda sold Mom's jewelry without permission. The jewelry Mom left to me in her will. It was theft." Understanding slowly dawned in his expression, followed by anger I hadn't seen since his stroke. "My Sarah's jewelry?" He struggled with the words. "She sold Sarah's jewelry? I've recovered almost everything. The police are handling it now." My father was quiet for a long time, processing what had happened. Then he said, with more clarity than he'd shown in weeks, "I want to see lawyer. Now." David Hoffman arrived at the hospital that afternoon. My father's speech was limited, but his intent was clear. He wanted Linda removed from all his financial accounts immediately, and he wanted to file for divorce. "Michael, I can start the paperwork today," David said. "But are you certain this is what you want?" My father nodded firmly. "She betrayed. Amber betrayed Sarah's memory." David looked at me. "This is highly unusual." filing for divorce from a hospital bed while the spouse is under arrest. But given the circumstances and your father's condition, we can make it work. Over the next week, the full scope of Linda's scheme became clear. The bank records showed she'd been systematically draining my father's checking account for months, allegedly for household expenses that included luxury purchases for herself. She'd tried to access his retirement accounts but had been blocked by security protocols that required in-person verification. The medical records review Detective Santos had requested revealed something even more disturbing. My father's blood work from his last 3 checkups showed traces of zolpidem, a sleep medication that wasn't prescribed to him. In high doses, or when combined with his blood pressure medication, it could cause confusion, disorientation, and increased risk of stroke. Your stepmother was likely drugging your father to make him more compliant, Detective Santos explained. This adds elder abuse and reckless endangerment to her charges. Linda's bail was set at $250,000. She couldn't make it. Her supposed wealth from her previous divorce turned out to be fictional. She had less than $3,000 in personal assets and a credit history full of fraudulent activities. From jail, Linda made dozens of calls to my father's hospital room, begging him to drop the charges and pay her bail. The hospital staff eventually had to block her number because the calls were interfering with his recovery. 3 weeks after her arrest, Linda called me directly. "Amber, please," she sobbed into the phone. "I made a mistake. I'll pay everything back. Don't destroy my life over some old jewelry." Linda, you didn't make a mistake. You systematically planned to defraud my father and steal my inheritance. You may have caused his stroke by drugging him. I never drugged him. Those tests are wrong. The evidence says otherwise. Please, I'm begging you. I'll do anything. I'll leave Seattle and never contact your family again. You should have thought about consequences before you committed multiple felonies. Linda's voice changed, becoming cold and calculating. You know, your father was planning to leave you out of his will. He told me he thought you were too controlling, too involved in his finances. If you hadn't interfered, you would have ended up with nothing. Linda, this conversation is being recorded. You're now admitting you influenced my father's estate planning under false pretenses. I heard her sharp intake of breath as she realized her mistake. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. Thank you for the confession. She hung up the phone. 2 months later, Linda pled guilty to grand theft, elder abuse, and fraud charges. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution of $127,000, the full value of my mother's jewelry collection. My father made a remarkable recovery. Once Linda was out of his life and the medication cleared from his system, his cognitive function improved dramatically. His speech returned to normal and his energy levels rebounded. I feel like I was living in a fog for months, he told me. I couldn't think clearly, couldn't remember conversations. I thought it was age, but it was her. The divorce was finalized while Linda was in prison. She received nothing from the marriage except the criminal record and restitution debt. My father had one final surprise for Linda delivered through her prison lawyer. He'd discovered that Linda's previous divorce story was fiction. She'd never been married before. Her entire identity was built on lies designed to make her appear sympathetic and financially stable. I want her to know that I know, he said. She built our entire relationship on deception. 6 months after Linda's imprisonment, I had successfully recovered every piece of my mother's jewelry except one, a small emerald pendant that had been sold to a collector who'd immediately gifted it to his daughter overseas. The collector had offered to contact his daughter about returning it, but I declined. Keep it, I told him. Some things aren't worth pursuing to the ends of the earth. I'd learned something important during this process. Revenge isn't about recovering everything you've lost. It's about ensuring justice is served and preventing future victims. At Linda's sentencing hearing, I gave a victim impact statement. Linda. Nelson didn't just steal jewelry, I told the court. She stole my father's health, his autonomy, and his trust. She desecrated my mother's memory by treating her treasures like disposable accessories. Most importantly, she demonstrated a complete lack of remorse or recognition of the harm she caused. Linda sat motionless during my statement, finally understanding that her charm and manipulation tactics had no power in a courtroom filled with documented evidence. I don't hate Linda. I continued. But I believe she's dangerous to vulnerable people, and I hope this sentence prevents her from victimizing anyone else's family. The judge agreed. 6 years in prison, plus full restitution. Today, my father is healthy and dating a lovely woman named Patricia, whom he met in a bereavement support group. Patricia lost her husband 2 years ago and understands the importance of honoring deceased spouses' memories. She and I have become friends, and she's never even asked about my father's financial situation. I keep my mother's jewelry in a safety deposit box now, except for her engagement ring, which I wear on special occasions. Every time I put it on, I remember not just my mother's love, but the importance of protecting the people and things we cherish. Linda will be eligible for parole in 4 years. I've set up a Google alert for her name and a notification system through the Department of Corrections. If she ever tries to target another vulnerable widower, I'll be ready. Some people might say 6 years is harsh for jewelry theft. But Linda didn't just steal jewelry. She stole peace of mind, family harmony, and nearly an entire lifetime of love represented by those pieces. The forensic accountant in me knows that financial predators like Linda rarely stop at one victim. They perfect their techniques and move from one target to the next, leaving devastation in their wake. But sometimes they pick the wrong victim's daughter. Sometimes they steal from someone who documents crimes for a living. Sometimes karma gets a little help from someone who knows exactly how to build an airtight case. My mother always told me that justice delayed is justice denied. Thanks to careful documentation, patient investigation, and the legal system working as it should, justice wasn't delayed. It was served exactly on time. Linda learned something important in that jail cell. When you steal from a forensic accountant's family, you're not just committing a crime. You're writing your own arrest warrant, one documented detail at a time. The most satisfying part wasn't recovering the jewelry or seeing Linda sentenced. It was watching my father regain his strength, his clarity, and his trust in his own judgment. He'd been a victim of systematic psychological manipulation, but he found the courage to seek justice even from a hospital bed. That took more strength than Linda ever possessed. 6 months after the trial, my father and I went to my mother's grave together. I wore her diamond earrings and engagement ring. She would have been proud of how you handled this, Dad said, placing fresh flowers on the headstone. I think she would have handled it the same way, I replied. She taught me never to let anyone take advantage of our family. We stood there quietly for a few minutes, surrounded by the jewelry that represented not just monetary value, but generations of love, commitment, and family continuity. Linda had seen dollar signs. She'd missed the most important part entirely. These pieces weren't just valuable, they were irreplaceable. They carried my great-grandmother's dreams, my grandmother's wedding joy, and my mother's hope that something beautiful would outlast her too short life. That's why I fought so hard to recover them. And that's why Linda's crime was about much more than theft. She'd tried to erase my family's history and sell it to strangers. Instead, she erased her own freedom and ensured my family's story would continue exactly as my mother intended. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply refusing to let someone rewrite your story. Revenge is simply refusing to let someone rewrite your story.